This is Po Kalainui, and you are listening to Hawaiian Potpourri on radio station KWAI 1080 on your AM dial. We had been talking in the earlier half hour with regards to, or regarding the Nobel Peace Prize, or is it now considered to be the Nobel War Prize, for their issuing the prize to people such as, what was his name? Barack Obama. He's not the name I had forgotten. Henry Kissinger, and now the European Union itself. And the article that I had read castigated the Nobel Committee for giving the prize to the European Union. First of all, saying that they are not qualified as an organization of states, and secondly, that they have not been conducting themselves in a very peaceful way, neither in the past year or in the last decade, in their declaration and participation in war against Libya, against Iraq, Afghanistan, and saber rattling against Iran, essentially as promoted by the United States. It's interesting that they say an organization itself cannot be a recipient, or is it really a union of states? That's correct, the union of states. What about the United Nations? Can that be an awardee for a peace prize? I don't know if the United Nations actually received the prize. I do know that the International Labor Organization, which its name sounds like an organization, probably a not-for-profit organization, but it is an international agency with member states included in its membership. It also includes labor unions as well as employer unions in its membership, and it has received the Nobel Peace Prize back in about 1918, I believe, 1919. There's an article in this morning's paper today, I should say, and remind you, is the 28th day of October, Sunday morning, and the article in the Sunday newspaper says that racial prejudice in the United States is on the rise. Anti-black sentiment hits a slight majority in a new survey conducted by the AP. Racial attitudes have not improved in the 4 years since the United States elected its first black president, an Associated Press poll finds, as a slight majority of Americans now express prejudice toward blacks regardless of whether they recognize those feelings. Those views could cost President Barack Obama's votes as he tries for re-election. The survey found though the effects are mitigated by some people's more favorable views of blacks. Racial prejudice has increased slightly since 2008, whether those feelings were measured using questions that explicitly asked respondents about racist attitudes, or through an experimental test that measured implicit views towards race without asking questions about that topic directly. The next question, I think, should be, do you trust such survey methodology and the interpretation of the survey results? The third is that, is there a reason why this article is being published at this time, so close to the presidential election? Notice that this article comes out, I don't find an article that talks about prejudice against Mormons. And is there what is that, a motive behind the article that is not being explained? Don't know. That's what the news says, or that's what the paper says the news is all about, and so you take that according to your own views on this matter. Okay. Yesterday's newspaper had talked about the Well, let me find it. Yesterday's newspaper. There were a number of articles that I wanted to comment on, and then I couldn't find yesterday's newspaper as I came up here. Here's an article that talks about employers who are pressing the voting preferences, or their voting preferences, on workers. And in the pressing of the voting preference, some may be directing more explicitly that we call upon you to vote for candidate X or candidate Y. Is that pressing a voter? What if they say that if the results of the election turns out to favor one or the other person, you may lose your job? Is that pressing a voter, or is just early warning of the voter of what the consequences of the election might be? The next question is it legal or illegal to press your workers into your choice of what the election result should be? Well, it depends. There are certain laws that prohibit you from being too explicit. Also, the Internal Revenue Service may get after you if you're a not-for-profit organization and you tend to overextend yourself in one direction or in favor of one candidate over another candidate. But to share your opinion as to the results of an election, for an employer to say that if President Obama is re-elected and the same course is followed as his last 4 years, in which you have medical, the Obamacare continues in the direction that it is now taking, then your employment will be jeopardized. You may lose your job. As far as we can foresee, 50% of our workforce will have to be cut because of the high expense of insurance. Now, is that a fair comment? Can an employer make that comment and still be protected under the general claim of free speech? I believe that the employer can make such comments. I do not think that it is a violation of any federal law prohibiting this abuse or this discriminatory practice against one's political views. So I think it's fair warning. That's my take on it. If you have any opinions, contrary opinion or opinion in support of what I have just said, give me a call. The telephone number here is 524-1080. 524-1080. Put you on the radio and see what you have to say. Yesterday's newspaper also talked about Mr. Berlusconi, who has been the head of Italy as its prime minister, and he was regarded as the Italian richest man, being very much invested in media. He was a media mogul, is that the term that they use? And he got involved with taxes. They have found him guilty of tax fraud. I'll talk more about that. I see that we do have a caller on the line, and so what we'll do is get to that telephone call in a moment. All right, here we go. Aloha, caller. Welcome to the program.
Hey, good morning, Polka. How are you this morning?
Fine, good morning.
Good. I've been traveling the last couple of weeks, and I've missed my classes on Saturday and Sunday. These are my classes, you know.
Oh, it is.
It's where I learn so much from you and your audience who calls in, and I really do find it to be very educational, you know.
I do as well. Yeah. I become educated by the comments that are made here.
Well, let me see if this can add to our education here.
Okay.
Going to make maybe 2 points. Let me see if I can do a little psychology education here.
Okay.
You know, when we step back and look at the challenges we face in the world and locally here in Hawaii, you know, whether it's the slaughter in Syria, the antagonisms in, you know, Israel or with the Palestinians, if we look at the increasing armaments and military in the United States. The article that you just read, the rising discrimination, racial discrimination, which leads to various forms of racial injustice. It's useful to pause and not only examine this politically, but psychologically. Why does this happen? Why is this so pervasive and has been throughout human history, regardless of culture? And there's a guy named Karl Jung who talks about a variety of factors that affect people's psychology and leads them to act in certain ways. And one of the intriguing cross-cultural phenomena that he talks about is called the phenomena of archetypes. And archetypes are these energy forms that people are, according to Jung, partly born with, but more importantly, shaped by the cultural setting, the environment, family, community that they're situated. And these are unconscious. These are not conscious energy that leads people to think in certain ways and act in certain ways. So there is a parent archetype. There's a mother and father archetype. And this archetype is unconsciously used to have people think of being in charge and think that they know what's right and think that they have a responsibility to not only guide but to dominate the way their children think and act. There's a child archetype or adolescent archetype, which is an unconscious way of being dependent on the parent archetype. There is the magician archetype, and these individuals have new ideas that represent magical transformation of the way people interact. These are very different from the parent. There's the judge archetype, which makes judgments in terms of what's right and wrong. And all of these have what's called a shadow side. The shadow side is the evil manifestation of negative thoughts that dominate people and oppress people. So it might be useful for us to think about how these archetypes are manifested in the military and, the autocracy of Syrian traditional government, and how people are moving out of operating from a child-dependent archetype to much more adult, much more warrior. Warrior archetype is a very important archetype in terms of maintaining or transforming society, and moving into taking action in very, very important ways. One might say that the United States society is really based upon leadership that carries the negative warrior archetype, a shadow side. You see that in Romney's position to increase military, and he uses this very irrational kind of way of thinking that might makes right. And you can see it in the style of Barack Obama trying to be a peacemaker in some ways, but then asserting a warrior archetype in terms of the drone attacks and ongoing. So if we look at that, the people in a society here in Hawaii or in the continental United States would do well to say, hey, we have a responsibility here as adults to create magical thinking that transcends the archetype that dominates us. We have the responsibility of creating a new world, and this is a very strong archetype, peacemaking, and warrior archetype, because people like Dr. King and others have demonstrated the warrior archetype through nonviolent resistance. And so if we think about that psychology, it may complement our political analysis of what's going on. It leads to the question, then what can we do? If we want to move into strengthened, positive archetypes that will help transform our society, what can we do? And I have worked with you in preparing an envisioning statement that is published on your website. And that visioning statement could be a starting point for some, or for other persons who are doing work for justice in the community. It could help complement their work. And there's 3 steps I think we're striving to achieve, Polk. I could be wrong, but I think one is, let's gather people who are interested in discussing how we can create a new psychological energy in our community that results in more responsible democratic action as we, the people, take back the power of these parent figures in our community. So let's gather people together to begin to talk about the visioning statement, how it can be modified, is it relevant, is it important. Step number 2 is to discuss, okay, if it is relevant with modifications, then what sort of things can we build on that are going on in our community, or what new actions can we take? Then the 3rd step is, if we agree that it's relevant, and we agree that we have suggestions to do some actions that complement existing efforts or to create new efforts, then we plan a strategy to implement action. Now, 4th step, of course, is one that says, let's evaluate how things are going. Now, people can join this process at any point. They can come to a gathering and decide whether, the ideas that are shared there are motivating and inspiring or are not relevant for their particular psychology at this point in their lives. So what I'd like to do, if you thought it was appropriate, and I need to take lead from you in terms of your show, is to offer people the suggestion of please going to hawaiiperspectives.org to read the envisioning statement, as well as other wonderful content articles that are there. And 2, for any of the listeners who are interested in understanding how they could participate in these discussion groups or other suggestions they have, if you would think it's reasonable to give my telephone number, they could contact me if they want.
Okay, and what I'll do is I'll give my telephone number so that not every cook goes and calls you and bothers you. I'm used to it. They're calling me, so I don't mind that too much. And then if they ask to get in touch with you directly, I'll give them your telephone number as well as probably your email address. And my telephone number is 697-3045.
That's great. And I was hesitant to ask you to do it because I don't want to feel like it's imposed.
No, it's not. It's not a problem.
Good. Well, thank you for this time. And we are going to be starting having some meetings in the near future. So the listening audience, if you're interested in this new venture, please let us know of your interest.
Very good. And I find it very interesting for you to introduce these archetypes, at least 5. Now, Karl Jung, I had a good friend, and as you mentioned his name, I'm sure it's Karl Jung, who was associated with who's that other psychiatrist?
Sigmund Freud?
Yeah, Sigmund Freud.
Yeah.
And you spell it Jung or J-U-N-G, I think, yeah?
J-U-N-G, yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the things you might kind of...
So he's not Chinese?
No. He's Austrian.
Yes.
Hey, one of the things you might think of, too, with Jung, I think he's very helpful, is this thing called a collective consciousness and a collective unconsciousness. And the collective unconsciousness is how large numbers of people in a society have their spiritual and their psychological processes impacted around a common set of values. Now, in the United States, I think the collective unconscious is best represented by your DIE model, and it's an unconscious way of thinking about domination. It's an unconscious way of thinking about putting me first in individualism, and it's an unconscious process that's manifested in the article here about rising discrimination, racial discrimination. It's a unconscious process of thinking about the importance of excluding certain people who are different. Now, at the same time, we can shape the collective unconscious in our schools, families, communities by helping to promote opportunities for people to meet and discuss how we can create peace and justice and provide an alternative to all the other influences that shape a DIE unconsciousness. And I think that's part of why I'm interested in continuing to work with you and others. How can we have discussions that shape at a deep core? You call it deep culture. I call it deep core psychology. How do we influence that so we kind of illuminate, even through our unconsciousness, love, peace, aloha, and justice? And that's very real for Jung's theory.
And I think that second step, not only identifying what that deep core or deep culture is that now exists, or defining the personality traits, but to show alternatives so that there are avenues by which a person can follow a different path rather than just showing where they may be at, what the conditions are at the present time. Because when we do that, we just raise the anxiety about, oh, I'm stuck in this mindset or in this corner. But the suggestions to be made to an individual or to a community or society of what the possible changes can be, when you do that, then it opens the door wider for a deeper analysis of themselves, or as the conditions now exist, and what the opportunities are to move forward. And many times as I hear these things, I was just listening to a program which is entitled I Am. And I don't know if you've seen this movie of a very famous producer or television or movie director. And he was making a lot of money. He was very successful. Then he got a slight injury that caused him depression, caused him to become suicidal. And then he began to ask these questions: what is wrong with the world? And so after interviewing many very famous people, including Howard Zinn and Chomsky, as well as Desmond Tutu, and the description of what the problems were, so he was able to identify the problems. But I was concerned about that program because it didn't really get into the second side of what the countervailing, or the way to get out of this stuck paradigm that you are stuck in, or that culture that you are stuck in. So it's always important to suggest methods of stepping out, alternatives. And that's why I am pushing so much the Ola culture as a way of getting out of the DIE culture. Now, there may be other people who say, well, in my culture, it's not really Ola, but it's something else. But at least they begin to see that there are patterns or pathways out of being stuck in that framework. I notice that the time is almost up, and I will have to be running along, but we do have another hour, so I'd like to invite you back and we can continue with this discussion. How's that, Michael?
I'll call back, and again, thanks for holding class this morning. It's inspiring.
Thank you for calling. Aloha. All right, this is Pokala Inui, and you are listening to Hawaiian Potpourri.
Kaulana pua o Hawaii Pupa ama hope o ka aina Iki mai ka elele o ka loko ino Pala pala anunu me ka paka